Hey guys, it's Frito here for your Overwatch. Today we're going to be reacting to a video made by Spilo, former Overwatch League coach, who has entered into the 5v5, 6v6 debate in sort of a neutral point of view, I would say, being pretty fair to both sides. And here he made an extensive video after doing lots of testing himself, and I want to react to the things that he says and some of the things he highlights about the trade-offs, which I always like to bring up, about either version of the game. We know 6v6 is on the way. The developers are working on it. Going to take X amount of months for them to get the tech up and running, for them to be able to put it into the game for testing, and we'll see based on its popularity which way the game goes. Either way, I enjoyed the game, but I think some of the things that Spilo shows off in this video is going to surprise you.
Studied, strategized, analyzed, and theorized 6v6 for 25 hours the last few weeks, utilizing two different versions of the 6v6 workshop code, playing both main tank, off tank, damage, and support, all while playing and spectating lobbies from Platinum to Grandmaster. Today I'm going to be sharing everything you need to know and prepare for with Overwatch's upcoming 6v6 experiment. For those who don't know me, my name is Spilo. I'm a professional Overwatch coach with over 10,000 hours of private coaching experience. All heroes, all roles. But more than that, I'm also someone who's coached in the esports scenes at both the Contenders and the Overwatch League level for 5 years. 3 of those coaching double shield,
lots of credentials,
goats, dive comps, and every variation of 6v6 composition that's ever been meta. Point being,
what's awesome about this intro is he's highlighting both that he understands lots of different types of team compositions, but also lots of different tiers of play, focusing more on, I think even now, on personal coaching. So really getting into the thick of how everybody plays the game normally, as well as what can be done at the highest tier and kind of implementing it from the top down.
I know the game, I know its theory in both the 5v5 and 6v6 format from both the bronze level to the professional. One disclaimer I do need to get out of the way is that while the developers of the workshop codes I used did a phenomenal job putting it all together, in fact, I interviewed them, you can check that out here, it's not Blizzard endorsed officially. It's simply our best guess at how 66 may look in the future test. The good news is that while the details and hero viabilities may change between now and then, the theory that we're going to be talking about today will not. Before we talk about 66, let's talk briefly about why Overwatch went to 5 and why it's considering going back. First off was Sustain Watch. Overwatch had a series of really unfortunate metas, whether it was double shield and a lot of other metas that just basically revolved around not taking space, not taking angles, denying the fun of a lot of the more fun support and DPS hero categories, with the goal of just going towards moving into big clumps, denying off angles, sustain shields, more healing, and more healing. This was a big issue because of a lot of hero design and balance issues were not addressed back in Overwatch 1. You see, say what you will about Overwatch 2, but the design and balance philosophy happens at a much more rapid rate. Back in Overwatch 1, we often had months and months with broken metas and no patch changes, and then finally when the patch did come through with some minor tiny little number tweak to healing, I mean, come on.
The Overwatch team has faced some criticism for being a little bit slow when it comes to our balance patches.
Who's this guy? Mr. Jeffrey Kaplan over here.
Original Shield Orisa, Sigma, Baptiste, Brig, and Moira, all characters that contribute to the Sustain Watch group up. Just
look at this lineup real quick. I mean, like, I can't think of anything less fun ever having some of these abilities put together. And we don't even like Orisa now. Most people don't like the Orisa rework and how it's fit into the game. I think, though, I will say I find these far less offensive in 5v5. These two put together, obviously, were obnoxious. But you can counterpick Sig, you can ignore him, you can run him over, you can find the lamp, you can get around Brig. Like, when I see these for 6v6, I have PTSD. When I see them and think of them for 5v5, other than how easy Moira is to duel things, I'm not a huge fan of that, but other than that, like, I don't know if any of these stand out as, like, breaking the game in 5v5, whereas when you have more players, you always are going to be able to synergize something. So whereas Spilo says, like, well, if they balanced it better or designed differently, maybe we wouldn't have had these problems. But I think there's a certain fact of the matter that more pieces allows for more synergy. You just have one more teammate on the field, more synergy is possible. And I think he'll get into making further points on this as we go through.
out and just basically out healing any sort of pressure. Notoriously a meta that was very unfriendly to a lot of the dive, more fun, and more popular characters like Reinhardt, Genji, Winston, Ana, and so on. Now, this was not necessarily a 6v6 issue. As we're going to talk about in a little bit here, there's a lot of ways in 6v6 could have functioned without this and done just fine. The problem was that a lot of the hero designs and balance done at that time was really, really bad. Regardless of whether this was a major factor in going to 5v5, I definitely think it was a minor factor because it was certainly a factor that moved us into role queue. Next up,
Now, I have watched this before, so I kind of know what's going to be coming up, but I want you to bookmark that because we don't agree on this. Sam doesn't agree on this. Spilo doesn't agree on this, but I think he contradicts himself later in the video on this exact point. He thinks it's not 6v6 if they just balanced it differently or designed differently, but I think a lot of these high-level competitive guys really don't pay credence to how difficult designing new characters is, and the entire argument of how the devs explained how difficult it was to design new characters that didn't break the game in 6v6. Because there's more options, it made it harder to design something new that was interesting and complicated enough to be like novel, to do lots of things and advance the game forward without synergizing with too many other things. Whereas when there's limitations in the 5v5 format, they can kind of just toss a new thing out, and maybe a character like Mauga breaks the game or something, but he's pretty inoffensive now, right? It's not like we have years of Mauga breaking the game. It's just one wonky character that is kind of oppressive, probably needs a rework or whatever, but they eventually kind of put him in a better spot over time. Like, it's pretty hard to say they ever got Orisa into a spot where she was fun to play and not horrible in Overwatch 1. She was just always going to be bad design, not fun for anybody ever. And, well, anyway.
Next up, individual impact through space, because this is something that when we're going into a first-person shooter that's going free to play, is people need to have a little bit, or need to feel like they have a little bit more individual playmaking. Now, whether 5v5 succeeded with that is up for debate, but one thing's for certain is that one player technically does have more impact on the battlefield in Overwatch 2 now. Finally, and maybe most importantly, were queue times. Now, I'm not going to...
I think the easiest way to prove that point is to go to 6v6 and see all of the new players for Overwatch 2 be shocked at the things Spilo's going to show later in the video. Like, the individual impact theory is like, can you actually get to ground to maybe hit some shots or not? Whereas in 6v6, there's a lot of cases where you can't even get to the ground to ever do anything meaningful.
I'm going to go into details here. There's a great developer blog post on this, but basically queue times for tank were a big bottleneck, partly because tank is just not the most popular role in any game, period. And secondly, because tank was plagued with a lot of really crappy, unpopular hero designs. Sigma's done better since Overwatch 2, but Sigma in Overwatch 1, Orisa in Overwatch 1, and a lot of the other tanks that were meta in Overwatch 1, it just wasn't a very fun role to play. So not only were tank players not very common, but tank was plagued with a lot of heroes that people just didn't want to be forced to play.
Okay, so this is a huge problem with his argument because tank was unpopular before these heroes were added. Tank was historically always unpopular. It was unpopular when Winston and Reinhardt were the only tanks you could pick. It was widely unpopular, in fact, where you would often not have a tank player on your whole team in the open queue era. So this idea that if you just pick the fundamental competitive tanks, like if the whole game was only Winston and Reinhardt, competitive players like Spilo and myself, we'd be having a ball. We'd be like, oh my God, this gameplay is great. But do casuals actually pick that? And I'll tell you from experience of seeing it happen for years, the answer is no. And I think because a lot of these guys were in the competitive scene, either as competitive players or competitive coaches, you get this myth in your head that Winston and Reinhardt are popular. Winston is not a popular hero in ranked. Reinhardt is, yes, but Winston's got one of the lowest pick rates in all of ranked. Go look it up. And you think what? Like that's going to translate to the average player if you make more characters like Winston? The devs have to decide if they're going to make tanks that appeal to a shooter fan base or tanks that appeal to the small subset of tank players that actually understand the role in a more complicated MOBA format, which 6v6 is. And I think the evidence will be overwhelming once these 6v6 tests come out, and the reality is very different than what the perceived philosophy is going to be, which is typically the case with anything in life, frankly. Like, your dream of what the idealized version is never what happens in reality. What you have to look at in reality is what real human behavior looks like. What tanks do they actually gravitate towards? Like, a more popular tank that never gets mentioned is D.Va. who is popular in both games, partially because the character's popular, and sort of plays the game in a more fluid, easy way, especially even in Overwatch 2, which is hotly contested at that she's a bad hero in 5v5, but the pick rates kind of don't prove that. So it's difficult to have this conversation because we both have to deal with the players that know everything about the game versus the vast majority of players that know very little about the game. And that knowledge gap is pretty punishing. Whereas I would prefer that we move into a draft format or pick and ban rather than restructure the entire game in a way that really only benefits a small percentage of players that deeply understand it.
Play. So the question is, after all that, why are we reconsidering 6v6? First off, let's talk about the philosophy about why 5v5 has had its issues. Number one is this solo tank problem of where when you only have one person taking the attention, taking space, baiting attention, you can feel a little bit like a human punching bag. And with two tanks, yes, you were a lot squishier, but at least you had the opportunity to have somebody else split the attention with you. In addition to that, a lot of the design philosophy around solo tank has leaned more into the raid boss style of things instead of having basically a slightly tankier DPS. And so what we have are these giga raid boss tanks that feel almost impossible to do anything to, and they can definitely introduce a lot of pain points into gameplay. I will say that it doesn't necessarily mean that tank is always the most impactful role. It often is, but Gavin Winter has elaborated that at least at the higher ranks, the convergence of which role contributes the most to winning a game is actually really close. And so that's good news from a balance perspective, but it doesn't necessarily make the game more fun to play.
So interestingly enough, I kind of disagree. I think tank is easily the most powerful role, basically because you can do so much with just one hero choice. So if you're a flexible player and you know not just how to counterpick the enemy, tank in the tick-tock counterpick triangle, but like how to solve the entire equation of the team fight. But maybe that's me speaking as someone who just peaked into top 500, like a master's level, just outside of top 500. So I'm around a top 1% tank player right now after the last few seasons of improving and working on my hero pool, kind of forcing myself into the thick of it. While he points out a lot of the downsides of tank, it's the major benefit is that you don't desperately need a key teammate to play around you just to function, which is what 6v6 is going to reintroduce, where the tank synergies, while on one hand feel fun, they also become utterly required for the gameplay to even function, for anyone to move on the map. If you don't have the proper tanks, two tanks, then and the enemy does, you get blown out in the space trade battle, whereas in 5v5, you always have the opportunity to flank and just ignore the tank fight if you want. Now, that's not true at the highest tiers because there's less mistakes getting made on the map, but the masses, I think, are going to feel the lack of space and just how it's sort of like a non-contest basically if the enemy has a good tank line and you don't, whereas you think that happens now in 5v5, but that's mainly because you focus on the tank fight as a squishy instead of just going and finding a different matchup you can win elsewhere. Like, you can win lots of games in 5v5 with losing the tank fight. You kind of can't contribute in 6v6 in a lot of fights if you don't have a tank duo, let's say, tank synergy.
In addition to that, obviously with the announcement of solo tank, a lot of off-tank players, people that used to play D.Va, Zarya, and so on back in Overwatch 1, were rightfully concerned. And that's definitely been a big loss of the 5v5, is losing the off-tank identity of many.
I actually think that's kind of weird. Like, I think it's more so that more tanks fight like off-tanks. Like, the mechanics of tank in 5v5 is more similar to off tank. So while I understand what he means in terms of like peeling and the position you play, whereas every tank is more or less on the front line now, the mechanics of the tank were re-engineered so that the one tank gets to have the shooter fun of off tank, because off tank was far more popular, right? While he said earlier that Sigma wasn't very popular, I don't know, I saw lots of Sigma picks because he was a shooter tank. And there was a lot of shooter tanks people liked to pick. The drought and the player deficit was always on the main tank position, which was arguably a lot more powerful, but far less popular. And that's a problem for the design of the game. If you're not playing at the highest tiers, if you're not playing in a competitive environment, if you're not playing with a full team, who's going to draw the short straw of playing the fundamental role that's required for the team to function and the game to function, but no one wants to play it? You know, so you'd get a lot of games where there'd be two off-tank players on your team, and someone's like, all right, I guess I'll pick Winston or Reinhardt, which, you know, I didn't understand because I liked playing those heroes. I liked playing those heroes in Overwatch 1. I liked playing them in Overwatch 2. But there's so few of us is the problem. There's very few players that actually dedicate to that, learning that aspect of the game, and it was like required for everyone else to function. Everything was focused on the main tank, and if you just didn't have one, how do you play? Well, you didn't.
Those characters and the tank synergy that so many people enjoy. In addition to that, the variety of tank combos is obviously just completely gone. One of the nice things about having 2 tanks is that introducing a new character into the hero pool is that you're going to have multiple different ways of comboing that character with all of the tanks. But when a new tank is introduced, you're just going to play it and nothing else. Can make the game feel a little bit more samey because instead of adding this new tank in combination with all the other tanks, it's just a new tank by itself. Finally, perhaps we have a little bit more confidence in our balance team to make aggressive changes as necessary for 6v6. You see,
so the point of like the team comp depth of 6v6, this is one of the bigger, stronger points for advocating for it. So much so that I would even argue I would rather have open queue draft rather than 6v6 roll queue, because then you could be drafting lots of different pieces of the different roles in order to make these complicated team comps. And so I understand this at a fundamental level, but also at the same time, it's like, you know, there's the I want to play 2 Roadhogs teammates that you might get, whereas they play Winston Diva, Reinhardt Zarya, and then they have all the space, walk over you nonstop. Like that, those things happen. The big problem with this is that and I said this on the podcast, I think that I was on with Spilo, and I don't think I've heard any other creator say this incredibly key point, that the design of the Overwatch 2 tanks is inherently boom or bust. If you look at Queen, Doomfist, etc., you know, Roadhog's mixed in there as one of the Overwatch 1 tanks, but one of these shooter tanks that don't provide synergy with another tank necessarily just makes the gap of team comps even worse. In Overwatch 1, you had a couple of these heroes like Roadhog that they were widely unpopular to have on your team because of just how much of a detriment it was to the frontline battle. Now we have lots of heroes in the tank category like that, so that's not going to make them better, in my opinion, because any amount of tank synergy, especially like Diva Matrix, Diva was competitively one of the top tanks with the highest pick rates for like the entire history of the Overwatch League in Overwatch 1, because of just how much you could do aiming that Matrix, peeling. Like a lot of people, they fondly remember that, but then they forget that that makes meta dominance, right? You have a hero with like a 97% pick rate across all these different metas because of the tank synergy you can have weaving in and out. And if you don't pick that hero and you try to pick a shooter style tank, you just get laughed at because they easily manipulate the space of the game, and you do no damage and they do damage. It's pretty simple, right? Like if you can cycle tank cooldowns in front and make space, and the enemy tank only can shoot, well, you're just going to slowly lose over time. That still happens now in 1v1 tank gameplay, but they only can be in one spot at a time. So maybe you can get some damage off and actually fight a squishy or start to manipulate, and someone can make something happen. Whereas when you lose the tank battle in 6v6, you don't just like stalemate, you like can't move, basically. Whereas there could be movement in 5v5. There's the potential for the format to do that. Now, we'll get into in a little bit later why that might not be fully the case.
Part of the reason why people have such a negative opinion of 6v6 is, as I said earlier, the design and balance of many of the characters at the time. Nowadays, while things can still be pretty ugly, at least there's quick adjustments and things they're willing to try and then dial back if it doesn't work. I don't think we would have had double shield with the current Overwatch 2 balance team for as long as we did. So how did we actually try?
Definitely true. It wouldn't have lasted. Nothing would have lasted as long. My question is, I truly believe that 6v6, based on the peak power of certain synergies and how stable a team comp can be, it inherently makes it difficult for multiple team comps to be meta at any given time. Now, 5v5 is veered a little bit more towards that with support synergies and supports just getting too strong in general, or DPS lowering in power. Like there's a lot of reasons why 5v5 can get more stagnant as well. Maybe you start to default to the one tank that's like the least counterable, but we've also seen the most competitive hero diversity in Overwatch 2 of any iteration of the game, even versus Overwatch 1 patches that were quite good. So this is kind of a problem, I think, for 6v6 defenders, because I would need to see that we can have the same amount of hero diversity as we have in 5v5. Like you see heroes all the time in ranked, you play quick play, you see a bunch of the heroes get played, and it doesn't really feel like most of them are a throw. Whereas in 6v6, if they have a top meta synergy and you don't, it's like, oh my god, like half my team is just throwing. How do I fix this as the individual? Whereas in 5v5, I feel like, at least for me personally, on all three roles, I have multiple heroes I always can go to. They're going to contribute in a big way. Now, maybe that's not the case at the highest tiers of gameplay on any given patch, because some synergies or heroes are just too overstated If you look at Sojourn, for example, for quite a long time, or Widowmaker, or whoever at any given point, that could be the case. Or often, like, Winston is kind of the default competitive tank in a lot of cases as well. I think 5v5 is prone to a few skill expression characters being top meta, but the alternative in 6v6 is BS combos that were easy to execute, like double shield or multi-tank or whatever, different versions of goats. It always is attempting to be some sustainy BS comp. And if there is skill expression in that teamwork, then those sustainy playstyles will always try to thrive in the meta, and it's hard for that to happen when there's limited defenses, meaning that offense is always biased in 6v6, in 5v5, and 6v6 it's the opposite. Defense was always biased.
6v6, and this is where the workshop comes into play here. The workshop is a tool developed in Overwatch 1 that allows people to make up their own custom games and really to get quite complicated with it. What the workshop developers attempted to do is bring back Overwatch 1 for those who wanted to try it. It wasn't really competition with the current developers of Overwatch 2, so much as an opportunity to go back and play the game the way that you remembered it. My adjustments that I made to this was to introduce the Season 9 projectile and health changes that I feel will not be reverted. You see, one of the limitations of the workshop code is that with the increase of projectile sizes in Season 9, they were not able to revert those. So while they had the original health pools,
this point's a little neither here nor there for me.
Projectiles were easier, so it basically meant everyone was getting two-shot. Didn't feel that was a very honest testing ground for what Overwatch 2 is likely to have in the future. So what I did is I had post-Season 9 health pools, post-Season 9 projectile sizes, and to give that as our testing environment for today. So overall, we're going to be looking at the good and the bad, noting that no matter the format, there will be upsides and downsides. So please draw your own conclusions from your own testing, and also reserve final judgment, of course, until you finally actually test the 6v6 thing, because this is just our best guess. Immediately upon testing, I noticed that Sustain Watch was a lot weaker. Orisa's rework, the mobility creep of some of the cast, the weaker position of some of the sustain/poke heroes like Baptiste, Brig, and Hanzo, especially in the code, made it feel nearly impossible to just turtle and sustain. And we tried. We tried the best variation of double shield. We tried running Bat Brig, and a lot of those combinations just didn't really work that well. On the code that we played, and what feels like the direction of Overwatch 2 in general, is that mobility and higher skill heroes felt a little bit more dominant.
I don't really like this result, because while he was very good to try to curb the data that he got based on the Season 9 health pool changes and projectiles and whatnot, I feel like this can fluctuate based on balancing. Don't we think? Like, if something's overstated, and if something feels too easy, whenever there's skill expression or some part of the meta that overperforms, the devs always autocorrect. So what we shouldn't do as the community is try to balance in a way in our test environment that the devs wouldn't do. Now, maybe even it's a better version of the game, but the devs try to balance for all tiers of play, and they really won't ever allow certain skill heroes like Genji, for example, to be dominant. Like, if we make any version of the game where double jump Genji is dominating everything, like mobility is king, well, they're just going to buff Brig or something. That's what's going to happen, because in the metal ranks of play, they hate playing against the flying characters and the double jump characters. They want to be able to easily pick Moira or a character like that who can look at them and stop them from winning. So I struggle to think that this version is ones that the devs would implement, and we have to be careful when we're making test environments that aren't going to mirror what's going to go out to the live game.
This was good because it shows that while the Overwatch 2 development team has had its hiccups, overall the game has moved a little bit away from the teeth-grindingly slow sustain aspects of Overwatch 1, even if you do bring back 6v6. And this means that one of the big arguments against 6v6 may not be near as much of a problem as people think. The bad news? Well, ignoring the queue times issue, which may be improved with making more appealing tank design,
never happened. We had 6 years of this. No, the tanks were as appealing as they could be at the start of the game. People still didn't play them, and then they only made them more interesting over time. So I'm the most excited to see people play squishier tanks and realize that that's not, while it's more healthy for the game in a lot of ways, certainly is, takes a lot more skill and teamwork and whatnot, a lot of improvements for splitting the tank category. It doesn't make it more popular. It's going to make it less popular, in fact.
Specific problems stood out, and we're going to go into these in very thorough detail. Number one, the space problem. Space is just generally more contested in 6v6 with or without double shields, often limiting solo capability to retake that space. Some of this is a stylistic choice, however.
Okay, hold on. What did he just say? Limiting solo capability. So this means you can't move without your team. Whereas in the self-regen, extra health, everything's sustainable, more deathmatchy style of Overwatch 2, if you want to go get a good spot on the map, and you know it's the power position, you know it's the one that can win the game for the team, you can go get it. Can't do that in 6v6.
Number 2 is the hero problem. 6v6 did not seem to solve many of the tank hero design problems, even with some of the balancing efforts done by the 6v6 developers. We're going to elaborate deeply on both of these points because both are extremely important to fixing 6v6 in the future. First off, let's talk about the space problem. Many of the 6v6 fears comes from bad memories of being held hostage in a 2CP choke with double shield. The good news is that while space was an issue, it was less of an issue than I expected, partly due to the reduction of sustain watch, what we talked about earlier.
Good news.
But it's also because map design in Overwatch 2 has evolved for the better. That being said, even without as bad chokes, there's still a clear increase in defender's advantage in 6v6.
The map design saves a lot of things. And I think like one big strong benefit to 6v6 would be that they might just rework all of the maps again if they have to, right? Like let's say the game's going to 6v6, we'll just take out all this cover. And now you need two tanks again to move across, but overall more pathways. We don't even play the game modes that were the worst for these choke holds, but the point is there's still going to be plenty of spots where you can choose to deny access, and then the game becomes about chokes again, even with the best possible map design.
As a tank setup plus proximity, being able to close the distance, is still a major factor in controlling space. Let me demonstrate. So if we look here, Havana first defense here. Essentially, you have two tanks split on either side of the choke. In Overwatch 2, with 5v5, there's more space for the enemy team to rotate around right side to attack the high ground, and it's a little bit harder for the enemy team to control that space. If there's anybody controlling that space, it's going to be a DPS or support, which is a little bit easier to clear out at that proximity. However, if we replace that DPS with a tank, that tank is very difficult to clear out.
A diva. This diva means nothing can ever happen here.
Because to get a sightline to poke that tank out, you risk running into the enemy tank or the enemy DPS. And to close the distance to quote-unquote brawl that tank out, well, that's just a lot harder to do to a tank than it is to a DPS or support. Anytime there's any sort of choke where a tank can basically play around a corner, contest space, close the sight lines, it can feel a little bit harder to retake.
Two tanks in the way.
6v6.
Tank on the left, tank on the right.
The case on a lot of maps. King's
Don't worry, we
Row,
got a wrecking ball. Everyone loves retaking with this hero.
Although interestingly enough, on Flashpoint, just because of how broad.
Well, let's look at this again. Like he's using this as an example. He's hoping that you just think this is obviously clear to understand his point. This is annoying to retake on 5v5 as well, but any choke that looks like this, not only do you have to stay with your team in 6v6 just to survive anyway, you have to clear these angles and push these tanks out just to play the game. There's one shield to the right, one shield to the left, and we're retaking with a Ramatra and a Wrecking Ball. It's so easy for anything to look that direction. If you don't have mitigation, how do you get through this? How do you retake onto the map? And look, they only lost the first point not so long ago. This is their respawn after this. Maybe there was one fight here, let's say, but how hard is this to do? They put one on cart, they put 5 up on these doorways, and you're 6 because you don't have the right heroes. You've got Ram Ball, which is just not going to be a tank line, right? You've got a bad tank line, whereas in 5v5, you just had one of these guys, right? And then you, as the flanking Curie or flanking Tracer or Sniper or whoever, you see the tank here, you can go to the right. And you automatically are in a squishy trade. So this is what he was explaining earlier, right? About the space control aspect of this. We'll mute this and look at his example. My question is, do we want a tank here on the left, making sure that this will never be worth your time? Or the reality is, like at the higher tiers, maybe just pulling this tank off, right? Surviving at all. Like you're not expected to even get a kill here. Your goal is to move the tank and force it to peel, so then maybe you have an advantage here. But in 5v5, one tank usually on the cart, it's like the most efficient place for the tank to be, right? Is going to be here. This Tracer gets to fight a squishy instead of have their damage denied indefinitely by a tank. That's the difference. Or the lopsided nature of 6v6 would mean maybe this player doesn't even pick a good tank. Maybe one team has the good tanks and the other team has bad tanks, and then this player is also effective, and you're hoping that your non-mitigation tank somehow offsets the value of how easy it is to just hold Matrix against the damage. All right, let's get back to where he was at.
A lot of maps, King's Row, Flashpoint, and so on. Although interestingly enough, on Flashpoint, just because of how broad the maps were, 66 felt a lot less congested.
I like this point a lot, actually. I think like the Flashpoint maps being massive, biggest run backs, biggest space, 6v6 might be the best on that mode. And it kind of makes sense too. If you've ever played a game like Battlefield or something, you think about the map design of those bigger maps. Having more players makes the most sense there, and it makes the least sense on the smaller map. I mean, we just got Clash, right? I think you're really going to notice, and Control even, in Overwatch 1 mode, the choke points that are existing on all of the Control maps, I hate with 2 tanks. And they're not great still. Like, those are the map designs I think they should look at again. A lot of the other maps, like Hybrid, they've taken a look at, but it's not great to go off a bridge in Lijiang. People remember it, but it's kind of BS gameplay as far as I'm concerned. And having multi-tanks to gum that up with defender's advantage, retaking into space is just so annoying. Like, you have to play the MOBA game before you get to play the shooter game in that instance.
The maps were, 66 felt a lot less congested. You see, the problem here is that a lot of people like to push out this narrative, which is definitely true to extent, that in 6v6 it's easier to poke out the tank because you have less HP. But the problem with that is that's not always possible with defender's advantage. You see, tanks in Overwatch 2 largely as a whole are all stronger up close. Now, they're not necessarily stronger up close to each other, but they're definitely stronger up close to squishies. For example, Sigma is largely seen as a poke tank, but if you get up close to Sigma as a squishy, that's a really bad matchup for 99% of the cast. And so the problem with that is that anytime that you have any corners, choke points, where there are multiple lines of attack, it can be very easy as defending tanks in 66 to choke out all those sight lines and force you to close the distance onto the tank to create space. It's not so easy to just simply take an angle and poke out the tank and a lot of these choke points. And while if you do get the opportunity to do that, it's very effective. If you don't, you're really relying off of your tank to take the space for you.
I think a big problem when you listen to a guy like Sam explain the inverse of this, right? Like Sam's argument is tank health points are lower, so you get the right positioning, you poke the tank out, and you force them out and make space. Whereas tanks in Overwatch 2, they're built to just be a wall if they manage their resources appropriately. And a lot of players don't like that because it's a lot of stats. Now, of course, the counter argument that often isn't said is, well, you're supposed to get space. You're supposed to flank the other direction. You're supposed to find different matchups. You're not supposed to expect to beat the tank from the front only or on the cart, because even as Spilo says here, interestingly enough, this is something I did forget about Overwatch 1, there's certain tanks that kind of would lose against other squishies because of the health points being lower, right? So right now, Sigma against any squishy up close is heavily favored, and every tank works that way, which is kind of nice in a way because you don't have to worry about certain squishies dominating your tank fight and forcing you to play in these really precise positions. If you get on an enemy squishy one-on-one as any tank in the game, you feel favored. And that's kind of a good thing for the playability of the game at an average tier of play. Whereas at the higher tiers, what they want to be able to do is get more strategic position and slowly move the tanks out of the way and get map control. The problem I have is that from a casual point of view, if you play the wrong tanks, if you don't have teamwork, that just isn't playable in the same way. It's more playable at a higher tier, it's less playable at a lower tier. And that is pretty problematic when you start to look to the format to solve some of these problems that otherwise are going to exist. A lot of the problems are universal Overwatch problems in Overwatch 1 or 2. And if we over obsess on trying to make benefits in one way, we're going to like inherit all of the weaknesses of the poor queue times, as well as the lack of being able to move the tanks out of the way, and then you just don't see a team fight, basically. Like that, when I look back to how much chaos is on screen in these 6v6 games, it's like it's utter chaos. It's less of a shooter game and more of a spam fest. You're playing tiny Overwatch out there.
It can be very easy as defending tanks in 66 to choke out all those sight lines and force you to close the distance onto the tank to create space. It's not so easy to just simply take an angle and poke out the tank and a lot of these choke points. And while if you do get the opportunity to do that, it's very effective. If you don't, you're really relying off of your tank to take the space for you. The importance of mobility and range to open up different angles cannot be understated. Many of the times where I felt choked out, it's because that I was playing a DPS character or a support character that didn't have the mobility to choose all the angles that I wanted to. And that definitely left some DPS, some supports feeling really good in the tank trades and some feeling really bad. Elaborating on this is partly why Hitscan was such a hit or miss, no pun intended, in this exact same game mode. When I had Defender's Advantage as a hit scan, or when we had Defender's Advantage as a hit scan, it felt very oppressive because to get to the hit scan, you had to kind of crank through two angles that tanks were holding in close range.
Look at all these shields, guys.
Attacking as a hit scan when you didn't have space could feel very miserable because closing the distance with most hit scan characters just isn't really a good option, even if the tanks are a little bit squishier. So finding angles and sightlines felt a lot more difficult. I found the binary impact of hitscan sometimes oppressive in defense, sometimes underwhelming on attack, to be a very difficult problem to solve with 6v6, especially with characters like Widowmaker, who went from being completely worthless in some situations in our testing to being absolutely untouchable. You are very reliant on your tanks to create space. So this is...
All right, I love this point. Hitscan's a very popular role, guys. People like playing hitscan characters. It's the most similar to other shooter games, Call of Duty or Valorant. Basically, every shooter game has a hit scan. And what he's explaining here is that the two tank phenomenon, the MOBA gameplay being so much better, it either means your hit scan's untouchable, where you're protected. I mean, look at the shield he's got up here. And then you start playing these shield break. We haven't heard that term shield break in a long time. What a lame idea. What a lame Overwatch 1 idea. Competitively speaking, you wanted to try to like do the math on your shield break versus theirs, and that was part of the calculus of understanding, does our team comp successfully push the enemy tanks out or not? And that makes your team comp picks more punishing, because if you don't have the right amount of shield break, your team might never shoot an enemy player. Let me say that again. You might never get the space or angle to shoot the enemy. Think about that. We haven't seen gameplay like this, where our team comp's good, their team comp's bad, and I can't functionally build ult off anyone. That just doesn't happen in 5v5. Like, there's lots of other problems, obviously, of course, but bad hero picks, quote unquote, like bad hero picks, have a space to just go play their position in 5v5. If you get into a spot as even weaker damage heroes that are gimmicky, like Symmetra, Junkrat, whatever, oddly enough, because they at least can hold their spot and see lanes to deal damage, it's less of a, I have to only clear space in a 6v6 choke, right? It's more of a, I'm playing the map. And that's what it comes down to it for me, that it'll be really hard for me to be convinced that 6v6 makes the gameplay better, because what we lost was the inability to go play the map. And me as a shooter-reliant player, I prefer thinking about the game in terms of map control as opposed to like needing the right picks to even go get it. You know, I want to be able to do it myself as any of the three roles. All right, let's get back to his video because he's kind of going off on one here. And we talk about Widowmaker. Another interesting point, this is important to remember, Widow was either utterly dominant and untouchable or worthless. And a big 5v5 argument is Widow is just better in 5v5. Well, yes and no. I mean, she's better in that she always has a lane to fight. She's always more relevant. It's less that she's going to be irrelevant, but I think she's also quite counterable by dive here. You just got to go play the shooter battle against her, right? Whether you beat Widow in 5v5 or not is whether or not your team flanks her right or you counter sniper. It's a shooter game. Whereas in 6v6, it's more of a MOBA team comp builder game. She was still utterly dominant on some maps, and I think this came out a couple weeks ago, so maybe he feels differently about it if he tested it now with Havana having its sightlines toned back in. But even old Overwatch 1 Widowmaker dominant maps like Junkertown were in his testing reworked now to have the sightlines reduced. So it's like, yeah, I don't know. Like the up and down performance of heroes is indicative of exactly my point of how much more punishing 6v6 is to the meta. Because if you have heroes like this, who in 5v5 are pretty stable, or like if you put a certain amount of skill in, you know what to expect, somewhat counterable shooter game. 6v6, it's like, does everything or does nothing. That's far more the case. And so because that's the fundamentals of 6v6, we should expect that the team comps are less diverse always. It has to be the case.
in some situations in our testing to being absolutely untouchable. You are very reliant on your tanks to create space. So this is again where the 66 versus 5v5 preference is. Do you prefer the more team coordination of taking space with your tanks, or do you prefer the individual opportunity or the individual impact of 5v5?
You need your tanks to take space. What that means is you cannot move on the map without them, and if they're on bad picks, you'll never move on the map. So that means their bad picks will force you to probably have to swap to something you don't want to play, just because you physically can't see a fight on the heroes that you're on, potentially.
It's why Overwatch 2 feels more deathmatchy. Not that there's necessarily less strategy, there's just more space, so there's more individual opportunity to take and hold space appropriately. It's more democratic, and there's no real guaranteed safety really in any position that you're holding, because there's always another angle the enemy team could take.
Love this point. I don't want guaranteed safety. Guaranteed safety gives me acid reflux. And guaranteed safety isn't just double shield, the worst version of 6v6. It's also Rein Diva. It's also the enemy has position on the map, and they have Rein Diva, and all you have is defensive mitigation in front of you, and you hope your Roadhog, a Junker Queen, get a pick for you, I guess, to make some space. Like, it's so much harder to do, I think, with bad team comps. Now, the argument Sam makes that is completely true is that the supports are giga buffed to compensate for this fact, so they dual DPS now. And they've got a turret, and they deal as much damage as a damage. So it's like, you're not free killing the supports necessarily, but my point is, I don't care who wins the exchange. I don't care who's the best role of the three necessarily. What I want is the map to move. I like to see different parts of the map, the angles of the map. I want offense to be favored. Whereas in this version of the game, inherently, defense is favored, and ult combos become much more important. I don't know if he gets into that at all in the video, but when you get into a format where stagnation and neutraling happens, where nobody can move, well, in a plat level game, it's like no one will die until you grab Dragon. And that's just not a shooter game, as far as I'm concerned.
In addition to that, I want to point out there's also a serious hero design discrepancy at taking different types of space. You see, a lot of the ugly stepchildren of hero design, like Malga, Roadhog, really struggle taking space when they could just constantly get poked out.
You could pick these two against Rein Diva, guys. And whether they revert armor, don't revert armor, it's like 2 damage mitigations that shut off this and shut off his ult. Meanwhile, their ults are pretty good. Asking for 6v6 means you won't just get one of these on your team. You could get 2. So the gaps in team comps are ridiculous.
Down. You're very reliant on your tank tree to take space, so if you don't necessarily have the right tank combo to break the choke, then you might have a bad time, even though those chokes are. The big difference is there's more individual autonomy in 5v5, but also one bad apple can ruin the bunch a lot easier. Do you find the tank trade / complexity of using C?
Oh, he didn't elaborate on this point. Having an off teammate is harder to hide. This is a big pro 6v6 point, where if the rest of the team comp functioned, especially if your comp was better than the enemies, you could hide as like a trash can in the 6, whereas it's really hard to be the odd man out. Like if the matchmaking is bad, or someone's having a bad day, or you have an easily exploitable team member for either their playstyle or their hero pick or whatever, you know, like if you're forcing a Genji into multiple beam weapons and he's feeding it, it's hard to save him, you know? And then once you're down that guy, the game's kind of over from a strategy point of view. Like, you're going to lose the game. The difference is, in my experience, losing that game is far more fun than losing in 6v6. Because losing in 6v6 means you can't even shoot back, and you probably won't even get kills with your ultimate, and you'll just get blown out. Losing in 5v5 is, we're down a guy, but I'm still building ult. Maybe I can pick off one on my own, and there's still like stats and frags and shooting game happening. But in 6v6, like I think players get too good and know too much about this game, and then they obsess over the result of the meta theory crafting, as opposed to the playability and the feel of it. Like, do you get to shoot the enemy or not? That matters a lot to me.
CDs on the enemy tanks with your tanks to scratch your competitive itch. Tank players especially like this, and for good reason. It's a lot of fun. Or do you like the complexity, responsibility of reading the situation and the space available to you as a DPS, a support player? Overwatch 2 has more options in that category. On the flip side, Overwatch 1 has objectively more immediate complexity on the tank trades, where Overwatch 2 has objectively more immediate complexity in positioning and controlling space. As often by the time we're considering
I like this point a lot. And the complexity of the brawl has many more steps because it's like this cooldown on that cooldown, and then there's an extra ult mixed in as well. So the complexity of like taking those angles that he's talking about, especially when both team comps are good, okay? When both teams are competent Overwatch players, amazing, right? Some of the best gameplay we've ever seen. You don't get people stuck at the choke, or the gameplay doesn't get as degenerate at high levels as it would in the casual gameplay. But then all of the casuals can't get out of any choke, right? Because one or two heroes not doing their job in the perfect harmony then kind of breaks that all down and you get blown out.
Getting the control of the space outside the tank trade, the fight may already be decided. For example,
so important there, it's like outside of the tank trade, and he's showing Ana, I think that's a good one. Another one's Widow. It's like the other alternative was like, well, a Widowmaker main who wants to play a hitscan character in a shooter game in Overwatch 1, you might never see a fight and your hero is useless, kind of like you said earlier, right? Whereas in 5v5, there's always an angle to carry. These are just shooter principles. What he's saying is like, Overwatch 2 is a shooter game. Overwatch 1 wasn't a shooter game. Like in Overwatch 2, you could pick a shooter character and do shooter things and play the shooter game. In Overwatch 1, we put 2 tanks back, all that could be gone instantly. And you might never contribute in the shooter game.
Take a Route 66 attack with double bubble Winston Zarya trade. My Winston Zarya might need to try to look for a favorable angle on the enemy tank, try to set up a DPS angle at the same time, and then off of that trade, look for the opportunity to stage for backline as a final result. Whereas in 5v5, you can more immediately set up your DPS on the high ground, the left side, the low ground on the right side, and look for a trade off of your Winston dive. This makes things a little bit more creative for your DPS, but definitely limits your tank options. So how does this affect DPS play?
Important to say there. I think he explained that in great depth, but the simple answer is your damage or support get an angle and contribute, and then you can win that way, as opposed to being stuck at a choke.
Well, there's more targets to shoot, but the choices in practice are generally not always super available. You can put a lot more pressure as a DPS character onto tanks now than you were before, but you might not always have the positions that you'd like to actually shoot what you'd like to shoot. So there's more options if you can get the space, but you probably won't always get that exact same space. However, for certain characters that have more mobility, I found this to be a little bit less of an issue. We'll talk more about that later. Supports, there's just more responsibility to heal. There's now 2 tanks to heal, even if their health pools are a little bit smaller, so you're going to be doing more of that. And also there's a little bit worse individual matchup versus poking a tank. Now, that definitely got better in 66, but unfortunately, a lot of support characters just don't do great versus tanks in damage, with the exception of maybe like Zen or Bap. So even though tanks are a little bit squishy, that's not really going to change how you position all that much compared to damage characters that just generally burn tanks better. This means the support with positioning is generally impacted a lot more in terms of not being able to take proactive angles near as much.
I think it's really important because especially the history of the game teaches us this as well, where the heal botting supports, even on player maker supports, was pretty common in our community because you would basically only shoot your teammates as Ana. But in Overwatch 2, I think we've already adapted that the support role is offensive. It's balanced, right? And I think players find that more fun, I'd have to guess. I personally do. I think support is way more boring in Overwatch 1, where it was sort of like, I just set up and my tanks are outplaying their tanks and I AFK and you win. And maybe like being a worse player makes you enjoy that experience because you're going to get more gains hiding in the back, not really needing to play a shooter game. But Overwatch 2 is more competitive in this way because you need to be able to duel. Like in the instances where the tank trade is being won, the enemy damage are going to come after you to stop that from happening, right? So you need to defend yourself or have a plan B. You can't just AFK and hide and expect to win. It just doesn't really happen in Overwatch 2. Now, that caused more responsibility on supports, and maybe that then biases more towards like brawly or sustaining supports that can run away. You know, Moira's been kind of like a staple for the whole history of the game to this degree, because other characters, maybe, especially if you're like a metal rank player, you're going to struggle to duel a Genji just because of his mobility, no matter how strong any of the characters is. Like maybe at a higher tier, the Baps and Anas will reliably beat the Genji, which is why high-ranking DPS players, especially streamers, etc., rage about it, because it's like, well, how do I beat an Alari turret? Well, at the average tier of play, the more problem is like the enemy support's just going to pick Moira and easily duel you. They're not really going to outskill you as Alari, because if they were that skilled to easily make that play, they wouldn't be in a medal rank to begin with. So yeah, we'll keep going.
You remember early Overwatch 2 where every support player was crying that they were dying off of cooldown? Well, that was part of the adjustment required for support players to be a lot more proactive and a lot more duel-oriented. Going back to 6v6 would be dialing this back, going the opposite.
I'm also curious, like the player base's skill set on any of these things, even my biggest criticisms, okay, would we adapt? Because I think support players adapted to needing to duel more, and maybe they didn't need as many buffs as they eventually got. They did tune it back a bit eventually over time, once there was that era of supports doing everything. Now I think they're kind of balanced. They could get tuned back a little bit, I think, but all of the roles are somewhat balanced. It's just damage is like clearly the hardest one. But I don't even know if I would say that damage right now is just straight up worse. It's just harder to play because you have less options, less flexibility, and supports fundamentally can just do a lot of things. You know, they can choose to be offensive or defensive, whereas damage, you know, there's a couple that do CC and whatnot, but they just have limited options. Like you got to pressure something and get kills. You know, their play is shallow by nature. And of course, the alternative would be like the interaction damage were too strong. So I don't even know if this is necessarily the worst timeline. But my question is, like, if we bring back the 2-tank gameplay, will players adapt? Like, what will happen? We don't have the same player base. I think our player base is more hardcore. That's probably the biggest like argument against some of my worries about a Mauga Roadhog tank line. Culturally, we might just not allow our team to do it and know it's going to be a throw, and no one would even try it. I don't know. In Overwatch 1, they did. And I think Overwatch 1 players were a little bit more RPG minded. Of course, remember, Overwatch 1 brought in a lot of MMO players, World of Warcraft. It was a classic Blizzard type game. We've kind of shed that identity, I feel. Overwatch 2 is just a shooter game now, and a competitive game at that. So if we say the competitive game, you kind of need an off tank and a main tank, will our community be different? I don't know. All I know is that's not what was the case at the time. Really important. And I don't know if Spilo has counter arguments to this, because he didn't include it in this video. He didn't counter me on this point when I said it to him on the podcast. Like, Ryan and Winston are not as popular as you think. Ryan is, Winston's not. So automatically, like, off tanks and off tank playstyle is more popular. Anyway, we're talking about supports in this section. Supports being offensive, once you're defensive again, are you actually going to find that more fun? I hate playing BAP in Overwatch 1. Hate it. Because it's all shield pressure, holding corners, hiding. Overwatch 2 BAP, insane. Incredible shooter gameplay. I see that echo out in the distance. I could take a position over here. I can pressure here. I can heal this, heal my tank. I can be a DPS, heal burst my tank. BAP I love in Overwatch 2. But there is no way I feel he functions in Overwatch 1. In their version of the game, it's almost as if he was saying BAP is bad. And isn't that great, because mobility wins? But we know for a fact the devs don't allow heroes to be in the gutter. At least unless they're like the most unpopular ones, I think. Like Orisa, they kind of don't seem to care. But they'll more likely overstat a character like BAP, so he does function for the average player. And then once you do that, what happens is the highest tiers of gameplay will really abuse the stats that he has. Whether he has the instant heal on the regenerative burst or not, the AoE healing will get nuts again. AoE healing is not that big of a deal in Overwatch 2 because you have all these off-angle threats, whereas it was a massive deal in 6v6. You can try to undertune it, but the problem with that is the skill of teamwork changes significantly. The players that have more teamwork make more abuse of AoE healing, but it also has to be scaled for where players aren't synchronizing together very well. That's a whole other aspect that I think isn't really in this video. And maybe that's something to highlight of, like, if you're the type of player to join in a lobby testing 6v6, you are not necessarily the mainstream free-to-play player. You are an invested player. So you probably know how to regroup, for example. Whereas in 5v5, regrouping is very important. They've kind of reworked it a bit to make it easier, but it was unplayable if you didn't regroup properly in 6v6. Whereas in 5v5, because there might be small little windows of time for you to get a flank or get a position and do something with it, in 6v6, that didn't really matter, because getting a kill or two on your own, your team still can't get out of spawn because the 2 tanks are gumming them up, right? Like, killing supports in 6v6 kind of didn't matter if your team still couldn't get out, because you have to kill even more to have an impact. Whereas in 5v5, you go and flank that Widowmaker on Havana. Now all of a sudden the whole map is opened up. Like, the map you get from those individual elims opens the map instantly. Whereas in 6v6, if their tank line's beating yours, 1 or 2 kills might not even do it. And that has to be true if we acknowledge that you could hide in the team comp, right? If you can be like the odd man out and your team still win, well, that means just getting a pick isn't enough. Whereas picks are way more impactful in 5v5. In fact, they might even be too strong. Like, that might be a downside, you might say. Like it's really easy to roll. But I'd rather that individual impact matter more as opposed to the team comp and choke formation mattering more.
Opposite direction. Not a bad thing, but again, personal preference. I found support skill expression to be diminished slightly, tank to increase slightly, and DPS feels about the same, just different. Finally, some heroes are going to leave you feeling gate-kept in terms of taking space, just like it did back in Overwatch 1. Off of that, let's segue into hero design problems. Let's talk about the good first. Some heroes felt pretty darn good from our testing. Doomfist, Junker Queen, and individual hero tweaks like Rhine Pin Cancel all function really nicely in the new environment. Oh, and both enabler tanks, Zarya and D.Va, felt great again, as their original identity has been restored. The bad, well, Malga had his moments, but felt demanding of the right tank combo to function. Turns out self-heal on the enemy tank isn't such a great design. Ramatra felt sluggish and survival-focused, and his long but overly impactful CD cycle left him with massive windows of vulnerability, like a Winston bubble but without the mobility of Monkey. Orisa lacks all identity besides focus tank and Overwatch.
Each of these are really interesting. I'm just kind of let him finish.
And so therefore that carries over to Overwatch 1, but that's now much worse as she benefits less from other tanks supporting her, and she doesn't really support the other tanks either. And then Roadhog, well, he's just awful in every single way. Turns out that while some heroes definitely feel better in the 66 format, notably off tanks, some heroes don't. Turns out a bad apple is still a bad apple, and a different, even better format doesn't change that. My experience with playing versus some of the bad apples mentioned before was a funny balance of being amused at how inconsistent and awkward they were compared to the voluptuous tank combos of Winston, Ryan, Zarya, Doomfist,
Oh, that's an odd word to use.
D.Va, Ball, and Junker Queen, and how annoyed it made me when we had one of those heroes in my team, especially when we didn't have space. You see, that's probably the biggest consistent theme between Roadhog, Orisa, Malga, and to an extent Ramatra. They all either have glaring weaknesses in their defensive capabilities, usually reliance on sustain or just survival, are tank buster focused, something that's a lot more awkward in the double tank format, or severely lacking consistent mobility or range.
Well, he said so many good things about all the different weird tanks that are designed in the game, and then now some fundamental stuff that like we should understand. So
awkward in the double tank format, or
we're gonna look through this, okay? We look through his little list. Tank buster tanks. I don't know if that's necessarily the case anymore. Like, does Roadhog tank bust? I think the sustain of Malga needing to be off a tank is still a problem. But these picks are playable in 5v5. I think they're bad right now, like in the current meta. But if I had one on my team, I wouldn't feel like I couldn't contribute to the game. Whereas what we're looking here, or the gameplay in the background as he's saying this, is a brawl mirror. Both teams on Ryan Zarya. He's on BAP. This gameplay is sick, right? Well, he's got a brawler and then there's a tracer off to the side. But this is the gameplay 6v6ers want, right? Where it's like, I got my cooldowns, I'm safe, I'm moving in, my tanker are making space, maybe my flanker gets a pick. That looks like Overwatch to me, right? But as we're watching that, he's explaining how, like, what if we just didn't have this, though? What if we had some of the terrible tanks that just don't make any sense as heroes? I don't know. Do we hate having Orisa, Malga, Roadhog in 5v5? Like, I'm not going to say I love it, but is it like I can't play the game when they're on my team?
Bad apple is all he's really impacted. D.Va felt
go through each one of this little list that he
really
goes through
in the new environment. Oh, and both enabler tanks, Zarya and D.Va, felt great again, as their original identity has been restored. The bad, well, Malga had his moments, but felt demanding of the right tank combo to function.
Yeah, because if you don't protect him or cleanse him, or if you have another one who's like him, he's going to get mitigated. Like, I think an easy thing to forget about Malga is his damage requires crit. So even shooting a Rhine shield is really, really bad. Like, you don't want to have to be shooting the Rein
Turns out
shield.
self-heal on the enemy tank isn't such a great...
Anything that slows him down in 5v5 or 6v6 is bad, and if there's two versions of those mitigations, like, when does he ever get to play? I don't necessarily hate Mauga in the current version of him. I think he's weak in the meta, but, like, they've made a lot of improvements to Mauga over time, where he's a bit more about the stomp, which is the most interesting thing about him, and the shout is more of a quick regen as opposed to long sustain. As long as they just get him away from I bully the enemy tank over easily, that's probably a good place for him to be. But I don't see any iteration in 6v6 where Mauga isn't just like the odd man out and always bad. Like, he would need to be reworked, you'd have to think.
Design. Ramatra felt...
Ramatra is my favorite tank in 5v5. Super stable, super adaptable, can really transform, literally, as the team fight devolves. What we forget a little bit is, like, it was easier to clean up fights, I think, in 6v6 if you have a pick on their tank, at least. Once you force their tank out, they all have to run. Whereas in 5v5, while that's the case, there's only one tank on the field, right? So there might still be squishy kills to always get in every opportunity. Ramatra is too generalist, I think, is probably what his point is. What we saw a lot in 6v6 over the years is you just wanted the best version of an archetype and commit to that combo. Where, and remember this was from a couple weeks ago, so he still has the cleave through shields in this version. Ram's just like, probably doesn't have a strong enough singular identity. Like, why do you need what he does if you can replicate it with another tank who just is going to have a more severe downside, but will be supplemented by another tank, you know, ideally.
Sluggish and survival focused, and his long but overly impactful CD cycle left him with massive windows of vulnerability, like a Winston bubble, but without the mobility of Monkey.
So, like, he places his things down, and then he's easily surrounded, would be my thought. Because tanks that demand space in a brawl, like, if you like the game in 6v6 becomes more like my tanks fight your tanks in a lot of cases. And Ram, like, part of the reason he works in 5v5 is he's a threat to squishies, right? And then there's only one tank and he can kind of block it out. But if he can't do that and the enemy tank's running over you, I mean, that's how you beat Ram anyway, a lot of cases now, is run him over. But he's going to be able to go run over your squishies in that time in 5v5, whereas they might be entirely safe in 6v6. So, interesting. Orisa also still sucks, both versions, it sounds like.
Orisa lacks all identity besides focus tank in Overwatch 2, and so therefore that carries over to Overwatch 1, but that's now much worse as she benefits less from other tanks supporting her, and she doesn't really support the other tanks either. And then Road...
Yeah, she's just a FPS character. The thing about Orisa is that she's actually kind of weak against squishies. I think that's what people don't realize. Like, a lot of squishies have the cooldowns to survive her damage and then poke her out. And while she has Fortify, she has Spinny Spear, that only lasts so long. And then she's just the big hitbox, right? So Orisa's best version so far in this rework, in terms of her playstyle, is bully the enemy tank with BS, stuns, and easy damage. And that's a lame reality for Orisa to be in 5v5, but she had even lamer versions in 6v6. All right, now returning back to the spot we were at.
Severely lacking consistent mobility or range. Pre-rework, Orisa Roadhog were horrible to play versus in Overwatch 1, but they functioned a little bit better due to one reason. They had ways to contribute outside of the tank trade, with also more team utility to contribute as well. Orisa's shield, hull, range pressure, and bongo were all phenomenal tools to pressure and create space from range. Not in a good way for balance necessarily, but in an impactful way. And for Roadhog, ironically, the rework made him worse, because he lost nearly all neutral pressure with the rework to his weapon and his alternate fire. It's either close range take pressure, hook, and that's about it. You can flank, but if the map doesn't provide those options, or you get poked out, you're cooked. Even newer kids in the block like Ramatra and Mauga were a bit awkward. Mao was very reliant off of Zarya or another dive tank to enable a lot of his all-in slam cardiac cycles, while being denied by two forms of tank mitigation to get his self-heal rolling. And Ramatra
that just breaks my heart to think, like, you could have two mitigation tanks and versus Mauga. Like, how do you ever balance this, guys? Like, it's already hard to balance in 5v5, but the argument is that 6v6 is easier to balance. How could you possibly balance it easy? Like, Mauga's an okay hero right now. What we're describing is a world where he easily is... you think counterpicking is bad now, right? Like counterpicking is way more severe. And not only do you counterpick the tank, the entire enemy team can't move, right? It's just not a game. And the thing is, there's a cognitive bias with this, right? Like we tend to delete the results that we don't like. You know, it's like it's confirmation bias, right? With this, where when you played that game in Overwatch 1, a lot of players would have just like memory hold this from existence and said that didn't happen. It was so bad. That experience was so bad. You refuse to remember it because you want to hold on to the memories of when you played the good comp versus the enemy good comp. And it was a great experience, but that wasn't at least half of the gameplay. He said something else here that I want to reiterate.
And Ramatra CDs are so long in his Omnic form poke so bad at range, they often ended up in just take aggro because bullying the solo tank doesn't work so well anymore. Tanks that demand support without providing consistent utility in return.
How is 6v6 easier to balance then, guys? By nature, 5v5 is easier to balance. Because counterpicking is at all useful, that means it's inherently more balanced. Now, we might not want counterpicking to be good, but for the Overwatch 2 format as we have it now, before we get hero draft and hero bans and all that, it has to be somewhat good. Whereas the counterpicking gets even more severe from the team comp level in 6v6. So much so that how do they balance it with numbers if they can pick two heroes that utterly win the game easily and you can't even contribute? Those are auto losses. The auto loss in 6v6 is so much more severe than what you're used to in 5v5. You assume it is because if you misplay and don't make the right adaptations for 5v5, or you lose anyway and you think you do what I say, you play the tracer, you go at the back line, you get your picks, but you still lose the tank trade, and then you lose the game and you're like, well, see, it doesn't even matter, 6v6. But those losses will still happen in 6v6. They'll just happen more severely where you get to do less.
They don't do well. Maybe there's a synergy in here that could make these heroes work.
And more importantly, less heroes will be viable. Less balance. Less diversity.
But we weren't able to solve them with the short period of time that we tried. The point remains, whether weak, dull, or frustrating to play with or against, these heroes are still flops in my eyes on the hero cast. And whether 5v5 or 66, much work is needed to match the creativity, complexity, and dynamics of the other tanks in the cast. Now we're gonna get into some feedback here. The last day of Pugs that we did, we spent around 4 or 5 hours playing with only high-elo players, masters, GM, and so on. And we wanted to try to create a more environment where people were more communicating, trying to play optimal tank strategies, and just trying different things. I got some feedback from all of these players that I wanna share with you guys here, which will echo some of my points before and also provide a different perspective. Number one, let's talk about tanks. Tank felt more limited, but did.
All right, high-level players should like this more, in my opinion. That's what you should expect, because they know how to break out of those choke points. They know the order of operations. They know how to pick the right team comps. Like, a lot of the issues of 6v6 falls down to the playability of the average player needing to know more than I think is reasonable to ask of them. So overall, we should expect that the tank players are very happy and all the high-level players like the complexity. Also, if you're the type of player that wants to get in one of these pugs, you would think you'd be biased towards even like considering it as an option, being open-minded. Like the harsh, I don't want to play this pugs, right? I know all of this already, you know? I don't need to see it. Like there's some revelations that were nice for him to point out here, but getting stuck at chokes, I already know I hate that more than anything I've ever had for 2 years in 5v5. So a player like me isn't going to even enter these pugs, so it should be biased towards preferring them.
Necessarily feel worse. Another player says tank combos heavily affected their enjoyment. Very, very high highs, very low lows depending on their partner.
Really important, because Aaron Keller said exactly this, right? And this is what I've tried to stress about the 6v6. It won't solve everything. All it does is make the game more severe, more streaky, less reliable. And perhaps there is some of the community that want this, right? I could be wrong. I could be wrong in that the community prefers this chaos.
In addition to that, the good news though is
but that is a truth. You have to say that's just the nature of 6v6. And I don't know how we can say that's the nature of it and then not also admit that balance is impossible. Because if the hero performance is so synergy dependent, you can't balance in the community choosing to pick the right or wrong thing, because not everybody can play everything, which makes it more difficult. And this is the high tier player saying this. Typically, the high tier players should have the hero pool to always play a good team comp, but it's like, well, we tried one and then we just got utterly rolled, right? Well, that's how most players are going to experience
when
the game.
Combo worked, the attention split from the other tank was definitely noticeable when coordinated or had the right combo. And this is great. In the 5v5 environment, one of the big problems is that all the attention is being put on you. Well, this player says if you get the right tank combo and you communicate and you synchronize well, it's really nice to not feel like everybody's focusing you down all the time.
That's cool. The higher highs are better because there's fluidity to the tank gameplay.
It's great feedback to hear. Now for the DPS players, some of them said that Genji Tracer felt all very good. Some of the more mobility options, because you could set up a little bit easier than some of the Hitscan characters, felt great. Flexible positioning, and you could actually have decent impact on tank trades.
Keep in mind, I think this would be changed because I don't think the build that he said they used would maintain. Like, if flankers are too strong, the devs buff the supports that stop them, I feel, is the nature of things. So I doubt that would maintain. But the point is that if you have to look at shields, then ranged characters are miserable to play because you need your tank to make space, a concept that hasn't existed since 5v5.
They said that poke heroes felt tough, and it felt sometimes hard to take angles with some DPS. It could be even hard to get support on these angles because your supports were generally more tied up supporting the tank trade. Chokes didn't feel quite as bad as expected was the general take. For support players, building certain support ults a lot faster was interesting, but you did have to play a little bit more conservative. We'll talk more about that one later. They said there was a lot less room for solo play, and there was a lot more healing, but it was still fun to play. One of the questions brought up by one of the support players has said, is there less room for OTPs because there's less playstyle flexibility in 6v6? Now you might, before you say, oh, playstyle, you can poke tank, you poke DPS support, we're talking specifically about positioning, because one of the challenges of having more congested chokes is that more of those chokes congested means there's fewer positioning options for an unorthodox people. Depending on the choke, you might need a certain couple of different DPS characters or support characters to break that choke. If you pick the wrong one, you may not have the space that you need to function with that character in that situation. Something worth considering. Now,
so many intelligent, I love the way that he talks about the game. You know, it makes me salivate to hear Spilo talk. But I think one of the things that I add to the conversation of this community is remembering what this means, okay? Bad picks are far more severe to your team's ability to play the game in 6v6. And he's talking from the support position, because from a strategy point of view, the supports need to be able to push the tank out. That still exists in 5v5. You have so much power to flex pick in 5v5 from the support role because they do everything. You can choose to tank trade, you can choose to backline, you can choose to frag and duel, you can have a good ult, have this. There's so much in the support category in 5v5, but what he's describing is pick the right support or your team can't move. Okay? This is important to me because I spent years making guides trying to get the players of the game to do what he's saying. Right? Like I felt like I had to beg them, kicking and screaming, pick Lucio or your team can't move. No one wanted to. Very unpopular hero. So you get these necessity heroes for your team comp to function that if your team doesn't pick it, you auto lose. That's what he's describing. Pick the right thing or you can't get out of a choke. Even here, it's still the case. Like on one hand, the DPS players' feedback said, well, chokes aren't as bad. Well, they also have the flankers and mobility to be able to get out. And probably other benefits like the self-heal passive will help a character like Tracer. Some objectively good improvements for Overwatch 2 applies to both 5v5 and 6v6. But the MOBA team comp builder is what he's describing, right? I railed against this for years in Overwatch 1. I hated it. Meaning that you have to draft the right deck of cards from your team to even function as a hero shooter. Not a fan.
Now let's share my study notes. So I spent the last day studying from overheads over many of the high-ELO games that we talked about, and not just playing the game, but actually strategizing and taking notes on exactly what could have been done, what felt good, what felt bad. Couple notes here. Number one, staggering was a bit worse in 66 because there's just more people to mess it up. It's interesting to see how this changes with the wave spawns that they're currently testing in Overwatch right now. Number two, distance is key for living tank.
Stagger, another reason why you can't play the game because your teammate died too early. Still makes it hard to win in 5v5. Still very bad, but because you have more space, you at least could get positioning yourself. The psychological aspect of that, I think, can't be understated, for me anyway. Like, okay, my teammate staggered, but I can gain a positional advantage for the next fight. Or I can do something. I can contribute to the base hero shooter game. Whereas 6v6, you're constantly like regroup simulator, MOBA team comp builder-a-thon.
Combos / dives as a supporter DPS. Proximity is very, very risky because in Overwatch 2 and 5v5, generally you can take a closer angle as long as it's away from the tank. In 6v6, there's now twice as many tanks, even though they're a little bit squishier, so you actually need to create a little bit of distance between yourself and enemy tank, and do so consistently because there really isn't any good close angle. I found myself dying a lot more often as a supporter DPS, not necessarily when I was just taking angles in enemy tank, that's dumb, but a bubbled Winston, a bubbled Zarya, a matrixed Winston, a bubbled Ryan, even something like a double.
Ooh, that almost sounds like the O word. Oppressive tank synergies? Is that what he's talking about?
Dive tank were diving on top of me. That was a lot harder to avoid through taking angles. You just had to do more stuff, more work with distance management. This reminds me a lot of my old Overwatch 1 coaching, which a lot of time if you're playing support DPS was about kind of playing a long distance, playing a corner, trying to keep a long distance between yourself and the enemy tank dive or tank combo.
What he's describing is the tanks dictate the entire game. This is the Jake argument, of course, right? And somehow Sam thinks he's outplayed Jake at this point, because tanks are oppressive in 5v5 as well. They're oppressive in both, right? Tanks dictate the game in 5v5, especially at a high level. But from a fundamentals point of view, what Spilo's saying is if he's chosen for death, he just dies. He's got to play a million miles off, and the tank combos, remembering, of course, that your tanks might pick bad ones and the enemies pick good ones, you won't functionally contribute anything ever. As opposed to the map control space game of a hero shooter in 5v5, you could go get map. You could contribute to that. But if you're not contributing to the MOBA Team Comp Builder-a-thon in 6v6, you're not playing the game. And you won't even see daylight to be able to contribute.
That was inevitably coming in. Something to point out. However, after those tanks do commit those cooldowns, they are a lot more vulnerable than they are in Overwatch 2. Moving on.
Very big point. So jump on that. Misplaying as a tank is far more punishable in 6v6. That little thing that he just glazed over is like, I feel such a huge percentage of Sam-ELO, my good friend Sam, why he loves 6v6 is because it's like, he's tracking the cooldowns. He's doing the math. He's like, oh, this is a recent use this. Like, she should die. She should die now, you know? Like he wants that to resolve. And players that really are pro 6v6 love this a lot more than he's elaborating on in this very short, concise video. Making mistakes as tank was far more punishing. Now, there's a downside to that, where if you don't learn tank properly, and if you're not good at tank, then you get rolled over, which I think is a problem for the average player, because average players in 5v5 can kind of just learn their FPS mechanics and do a lot at an average tier of play. But in 6v6, you have to learn calculus on how to not, you have to learn so much more just to have a baseline approach to the game. It helps the high level tank v tank gameplay a lot, but it also makes mistakes far more punishing and gruesome. Like, you're out of position, boom, you're dead. Whereas in 5v5, there's a little bit more leeway, right? You've got an extra cooldown, a little bit more sustained, got a little bit more health. So it's like one thing's not going to blow you up. There's a benefit and a curse to that, right? Pros and cons. It means Sam feels like he can't kill the tank, but it also means the average plat player can step out of position for a second and not need to play perfectly just to survive on the front line. You get to feel tanky in 5v5, whereas you don't feel tanky in 6v6. You feel like you have to play the perfect hero team comp builder-a-thon gameplay and cycle those cooldowns. Like, the barrier of entry to even function and enjoy it is much higher. The ceiling is higher as well, but for the average player, it's like, I really can't wait for these tests to come out, because getting blown up randomly as Winston because like your diva didn't matrix you in or you didn't get a bubble at the right time. I mean, it's everything I hated about tank in 6v6, and I'm glad to have it gone. I do not want it back, you know, even though I was a much higher rated player, because I understood and exploited those things. But the game being mostly about just cycling tank cooldowns, it starts to sound really silly, honestly. Like why do we enjoy that? I really don't get the appeal. It was far easier to tank just learning that. Whereas in Overwatch 2 tank, I have to learn, I have to shoot, I have to aim, I have to land these abilities. My APM's gotta be through the roof. It's way more engaging of a gameplay. Now, it's punishing in its own ways, but I think the biggest buff to the enjoyment of Overwatch 2 tank will be to play Overwatch 1 tank again.
From here, tanks must clear and hold space on angles. It is your responsibility to create clear space, not just to group up and choke, but also to contest other chokes. DPS and supports cannot consistently do
Yeah, and that tank gameplay, if you don't do it, your whole team can't play. Just remember that.
own in most spots, especially if there's an enemy tank there. Angles still matter in 6v6 just as much as they did in 5v5, but you're a lot more reliant on your tanks to actually control those chokes and angles than you were in Overwatch 2, where there's a little bit more individual autonomy. There's some interesting dynamics that kind of revolve around this, where is it better to support my tank on main or defend clear an angle that's wide open? It becomes more of a priority to support maybe the tanks on main because there's now 2 of them that you have to support as a healer, but it's a much more of a resource commitment requirement, and then you might leave yourself vulnerable to an angle. It's a tricky balance. Finally, the last thing here, and this is really important, is when you don't have space in 66, hero pick matters a lot more. We talked about this earlier. There's going to be a lot of
6v6 is easier to balance, though, remember.
chokes, a lot of positions. Maybe they don't have verticality, maybe they do have verticality, maybe they have flanks, maybe they don't have flanks, maybe it's close, maybe it's long. You need to pick the right DPS or the support for the situation, because taking space with every DPS and with every support character is just not as possible in the 66 format.
And alternatively, in 5v5, the reason why that's not as much the case is because you don't have perfect team comps. The enemy in 6v6 could have a perfect team comp, and you having a wonkier pick, you're not going to have a lane to go play your position and get your value if it's not ideal. And this is why meta stagnation is definitely worse in 6v6, because the top meta synergies are just simply better than the other strategies you could run. Whereas in 5v5, if you want to play an off-meta hero, you can kind of force it if you just go get your spot of the map that you're good in. And you'll get some value. You won't be a hard throw. Now, the tank role can't quite do that as easily unless you're deciding to do that on some of the top picks. Like, the tank role can be counterpicked, so that a lot of the conversation comes around that. If they all decide to counterpick you, then yeah, you probably should swap. But for the other 4 roles, or 4 teammates, way more reliant. And when you start to talk about required heroes that are unpopular, like Lucio or main tank, I don't know. I'm struggling to see the upside here.
It's a funny callback to the rock, paper, scissors problems that 5v5 has. 5v5 has the tank rock, paper, scissors, where counterpicking the enemy tank, especially as the tank, can feel more valuable than it has a right to be. And 66, counterpicking the space, counterpicking the map is actually very, very important. Final thoughts here. I'm going to ride the fence with this one because I frankly haven't played the official attempt at 66 and nobody has. But I will say this, I did have a lot of fun, and there's a lot of potential for this game mode, especially with appropriate adjustments to hero design and considerations for some of 66 downsides. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, but first, seriously, I encourage you to test these things first, not only to give you a better perspective on exactly the feedback of things, but also because it's just a lot of fun. I'll drop my code in the comments, which is the one that's post-Season 9, but you can also have your own matchmaker one that's pre-Season 9, and you don't even need to do anything. Just
I'll put this in my description as well.
Ready to roll. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Let's see what happens in the future.
Okay, guys. So some major key takeaways. 5v5, 6v6. Things that we should know. I think 6v6 got to have hero bans based on everything he just said there by the end. Because it's like you're going to have heroes that will never function in 6v6. And will always have options for the enemy to MOBA team comp builder. He said it multiple times, multiple different ways, where your hero choices matter so much more, right? So because of that, the design of the heroes that they add to the game is so much more crucial. It's easier to design heroes for 5v5 because we know the different archetypes of what you can do. You can flank, you can tank trade, you can get space on the map, you can hide in a hole, you can play a long range. It's all hero shooter stuff, right? Whereas when you add new elements into 6v6, before you know it, it's like, oh, we got a bunker. Oh, we've got this unkillable brawl thing. We've got, like, the team comps take new formations that break the game. And I think I'll be more excited for them to properly add it to the game if there's hero bans, because at the very least, you could take some of those hard counter options out so you could play certain heroes you like. I think that's the main thing I think people are going to dislike more, is that in a competitive mindset of 6v6, it has higher teamwork potential, but it also has much less forgiving individual expression. And what I mean is, you can't play worse things and expect to win. You can't play suboptimal characters. Whereas in 5v5, there's a lot of budget versions of the same thing that still more or less can do the job. So that means you're less on your hero pick and more on can you actually even play that hero? Like, you might get into a position in 5v5 where maybe a given hero is the most ideal version, but you're not as good at them. So you can play a budget version and still enjoy your hero, enjoy your time. 6v6, that's not the case, which the biggest 6v6 advocates say the opposite of this. But I just feel like Spilo agreed with me on this point for 20 minutes of his video, an hour of mine, of me reacting to this. Your hero choice matters more. He said it multiple times. So because of that, do you think that means you can express yourself and play off meta heroes easier? Or are you just going to throw for your whole team if you try to do that? 5v5 fits the kind of community we have, or at least the one that we had. So I'm optimistic that a new, more competitive crowd might maximize what this mode can do, but glossed over here as well is just the queue time reality, right? Like, all these downsides we discussed, plus worse queue times, do we really think that this is going to improve the game, or does it just rearrange the problems we already had and maybe exacerbated many that you didn't even see coming? Like the counterpick tank issue getting worse. That's what I feel like he described in this video, is that the counterpicking tank issue can get even worse, which is what I said in the podcast the last time I spoke to Spilo, or actually 2 podcasts ago, now that I think about it, on this issue anyway. I said counterpicking on tanks will just be worse in 6v6 because of the tank design. And a lot of those tank designs we think are fun. So how do you do that, you know? All right, guys, long reaction video. I loved this video from Spilo, and I wanted to make a reaction. I hope, 90 minutes of it is considered transformative for the community. So much cool things to talk about. I love this conversation. I also think that we've kind of allowed our obsession with the idealized version of what we all want Overwatch to be to overshadow some very obvious realities. Like, I'm struggling to see anything from this video of this very respected analyst that counteracted the main arguments I've made about this the entire time. Like, I really want to be convinced, but he basically just agreed with me the whole time about both sides, right? It's not like I don't understand the benefits of 6v6. It just isn't worth the trade-offs. And I think he stumbled into or researched into some of my main points, which I'm not sure he necessarily even agreed with originally. So, yeah, I don't know. Too much chaos on screen, too many ults, too much regroup, too much holding hands, too much your team work and team picks mattering. I don't know if the casual players want to play this. Remember, we have a free-to-play audience now. On one hand, some of them are more hardcore, but on the other hand, some of them are more casual. Like, they get to just play Widowmaker all the time now if they want. What happens when you get that player on your team now, and then you don't get good tanks? And when I say good tanks, I mean ones that synergize, because you get a random roll of teammates, remember? Sometimes you'll get tanks that cooperate, sometimes you won't. So you can have an entire team that just doesn't play the game. And that's, by design, I think going to happen more the more they keep adding heroes. Because you get people that maybe only play Venture, only play Zarya, whatever. Overwatch 1, we had a lot of that. A lot of only off-tank players. I'm excited for this to happen because I'm almost certain the narrative on this has to change. That's how I feel about it. Like, how are we coming out with a video like this and we're still all excited for 6v6? How do you see these choke points that we can't escape and we're like, wow, this is good Overwatch right here. Not accessing space ever. Their takes are countering mine, and oh my goodness, man. All right, guys, long video. Catch you guys next time.